Good morning. So in our Messianic prophecy class here, we mentioned a few weeks ago that the two books that have the most Messianic prophecies and references are Psalms, and we spent 2 weeks looking at Messianic Psalms, and now we'll spend 2 weeks looking at Isaiah, because Isaiah is really rich with Messianic prophecy, and the Jews took a lot of hope for the Messiah from what they read in Isaiah. And in the New Testament, there are many quotations from both the Messianic Psalms and from the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is quoted more than any other Old Testament book in the New Testament except for the Psalms. And Isaiah was writing late in the 8th century BC. He was writing during the time of the Assyrian captivity of the northern tribes, but he was living in Judah, and he was primarily writing to Judah. And about this time, the message not only of Isaiah, but of some other prophets was, look what happened to the northern tribes. The same thing will happen to you in Judah if you don't come back to the Lord. And in the midst of those kind of warning judgment prophecies, though, God always offered hope. So you see this contrast many times in Isaiah, where you've got the fire and brimstone, and then all of a sudden you have a passage of hope. You have but someday the Messiah will come, and someday the kingdom will be restored, so on. It's not all just judgment. So there were two sources of hope in Isaiah passages. Someday you're going to return from your exile, and someday after that, there will be a Messiah. So there's a near-term concern. What about these enemies? What about the impending exile? But then there's a long-term concern. What about the future of all the promises God has made to his people? And a lot of scholars and a lot of Christians use the phrase now and not yet. Because in many of the prophecies in the Old Testament, you can see that some of the prophecy is about to happen right now. Right now you're about to be delivered from that invading army. But then there's portions of the prophecy that don't fit right now. They're obviously futuristic beyond the immediate short-term future. They don't fit any particular king of Judah. They can only fit the Messianic king, and that's the not yet part of the prophecy, which we will see. Now there's three different primary themes in Isaiah. The first is the Messiah as king, and you see just from the number of chapters listed, if that's only one of the three, we're not going to have time to read all of the passages about the Messiah in Isaiah. We're going to look at the highlights. In the first half of the book, the Messiah as king is a recurring theme. And then in the next quarter of the book, the Messiah as the servant, the suffering servant, or the servant of the Lord. And that includes, of course, a very famous passage for us from Isaiah 52 and 53 that we're going to spend most of the class on a week from now. And then finally we have the Messiah as the anointed one who conquers and who brings the good news, which we'll see next week also. because the proclaimer of good news is, good news in the Greek New Testament is the gospel. So it was prophesied that the Messiah brings this gospel, or this new good news someday. Now, we also have some brief references that could sort of fit those themes and sort of not. The Messiah as a branch of the Lord. And the image that's used in more than one place in the Old Testament is the house of David has been reduced to a stump. Picture a stump sitting up on the ground. But from that stump, a little shoot shall grow up. You've seen that happen with a stump. The message is, yes, you have been punished, and yes, the house of David has been reduced to a stump. But that doesn't mean that God goes back on his promises. God promised something everlasting from the lineage of David. And so there's going to be this revival. The little shoot will come up from the little branch will come up out of the stump, and then it'll start to grow. That image occurs multiple times in the Old Testament. There's also a passage in which the Messiah is referred to as the foundation stone. We saw a reference last week in the Psalms that Jesus quoted and applied to himself. The very stone that the builders rejected has been made the cornerstone now. And this passage is quoted in the New Testament. And then there's a lengthy reference in Isaiah 30 to the Messiah as a new teacher. But we'll start out this week, we'll look at the Messiah as the king. And there's a very famous passage, Isaiah chapter 9, and we especially remember verse 6 with the names of the Messiah. But let's just read. Nevertheless, the gloom of the distressed land will not be like that of the former times when he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. So the northern tribes have been carried off into captivity just recently at this point. And he's saying, yes, there's doom coming, but it's not going to be quite like that. But in the future, he will bring honor to the way of the sea, to the land east of the Jordan, and to Galilee of the nations. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light, quoted by Jesus of himself in the New Testament. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased its joy. The people have rejoiced before you as they rejoice at harvest time, as they rejoice when dividing spoils. For you have shattered their burdensome yoke, and the rod on their shoulders, the staff of their oppressor, just as you did on the day of Midian in the wilderness. For the trampling boot of battle and the bloodied garments of war will be burned as fuel for the fire. That's another picture of peace. Many, many times in our Messianic prophecies, we see that the Messiah somehow brings peace. Now we'll see that's a spiritual peace primarily. Not primarily just an end to wars, because as Jesus says in the New Testament, you will continue to have wars and you'll hear rumors of wars and so on. But there's a spiritual peace, a reconciliation that's brought worldwide through the Messiah. And then it goes on to say, for a child will be born for us. A son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. The dominion will be vast, and its prosperity will never end. He will reign in the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So there's some things that we see. It starts out hopeful, and of course we have this famous verse that's been quoted many, many times out of this passage with the names of the Messiah. The now, the near term, in verse 4. The rod on their shoulders, the staff of the oppressor will be broken, just as when the people were attacked by Midian in the wilderness after the Exodus. So this is more of a, you're going to be delivered from this immediate concern, which is this invasion from the north that's going on right now. But the not yet, the longer term, is a different kind of peace that some future child who's born is going to bring. There's no time for him to be born right now and grow up and deal with the short-term problem. This is a long-term prophecy. And if you take a look at it, if you take a look, we've seen that in many cases, whether it's Jews who don't like what Christians have done with certain messianic passages, or it's certain scholars will try to say, oh, certain passages that the Christians use as messianic passages aren't really about the future. They're about the immediate, they're about some king. Now at this time, King Ahaz is the king of Judah, and his son, who is going to be king, is Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was a good king. And there was a later good king, Josiah, and we've studied a lot about this on Wednesday nights. And so it's quite frequent for people to say, oh, these prophecies are not really about Jesus. They're about a king is going to come about real soon, like Hezekiah. But take a look at verse 6. What king, Hezekiah or anybody else, is going to be referred to as mighty God, eternal Father? Hezekiah wasn't called that, and for good reason. Josiah, nobody else. So, obviously, the futuristic language that a child will be born and that he will grow up and become this king isn't going to apply to Hezekiah. The book has been written now on Hezekiah. He wasn't called God. So, in Isaiah 11, we have another picture of this Messianic king bringing peace. And we have this image again from the root of Jesse. So Jesse was the father of David, so it emphasizes the Davidic lineage, but it also recalls the root and the branch language that comes out of the stump. But it says in Isaiah 11 that this new king, this new Messianic king, is especially taking care of the poor and the meek and the blind and the lame and so on. Which Old Testament king does that describe? When we study on Wednesday night, we've gone through all these kings and we say this king was pretty good, this one wasn't. What made the good kings good? They brought an end to the idolatry. And if they were really good, they even went out and got out of Jerusalem and went around the countryside and got rid of the pagan altars and so on. That's what made a good king good. No king, if you study all the 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, no kings told, well, he especially went out and took care of the poor, the blind, that fits Jesus. But that wasn't what they asked for from any king in the Old Testament, and that's not what we read. And then we have the passage about, in chapter 11, about the lamb and the lion lying down together, right? That's a picture of peace. Verses 6 through 9. The wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf, the young lion, and the fatling will be together, and a child will lead them. The cow and the bear will graze, their young ones will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. An infant will play beside the cobra's pit, and a toddler will put his hand into a snake's den. No one will harm or destroy on my entire holy mountain, for the land will be as full of the knowledge of the Lord as the sea is filled with water. So this is the picture of peace. Now, there are some people, if we get into the interpretations of Revelation and prophecy and so on, that believe that this is literal, that there's some future age in which, literally the lions will be vegans, and so on. But I think it's a picture of spiritual peace. It's a picture that there's no more conflict between peoples in the Lord, because this kingdom will be universal. One of the themes we've seen is the Messiah is for everyone, for all nations, and therefore there's no need for people who live in the Lord from different nations to be in conflict. And it says that Judah and Israel will be united in verses 10 through 16, and that God will call those who love him out of all the nations of the earth will be part of one kingdom. So within each nation on earth there will be people who follow the Lord, and they'll all be part of this new kingdom. Did this ever happen before Jesus? Did this happen under some Israelite king? Were Judah and Israel ever united under any Old Testament king again? What was the situation with the former people of the northern tribes and the descendants from the southern tribe of Judah, even at the time of Christ? Who were the descendants of the northern tribes in New Testament times? The Samaritans, right? And were the Samaritans united with the other Jews in the New Testament? There was no unity of any kind, right? So this obviously never happened in some literal, physical sense in the Old Testament times. But then when the gospel came and the kingdom came, it reached out to Jews, Samaritans, Gentiles, all the nations of the world. So then it begins to be fulfilled. Now, in the second section of Isaiah, we get the Messiah as the servant or the suffering servant in these chapters. Sometimes it says servants in this section and seems to refer to all of God's people serving him, but sometimes it's singular and it refers to an individual man, the servant. And so there are 4 what are called servant songs that refer to this individual servant of God who's a Messiah in this section. The first one is in chapter 42, where it refers to the ministry of this servant. This is my servant, I strengthen him. This is my chosen one, I delight in him. I have put my spirit on him. He will bring justice to the nations. Now remember, the nations refers to all the Gentile nations, not just the Jewish nation. He will not cry out or shout or make his voice heard in the streets. In other words, he won't attract attention to himself. He's not self-seeking. He will not break a bruised reed, and he will not put out a smoldering wick. So he will not be a king who somehow achieves victory through violence. Somehow he's a different kind of king who's a servant at heart. He will not grow weak or be discouraged until he has established justice on earth. So he doesn't glorify himself. He won't tire until he achieves that messianic mission. And then in verses 5 to 7, this is what God the Lord says, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you for a righteous purpose, and I will hold you by your hand. I will keep you, And I will make you a covenant for the people and a light to the nations, in order to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, and those sitting in darkness from the prison house. So once again, this is a servant. He even goes to the prisoners. We'll see Jesus applying this kind of language to himself next week. He's a light to the nations, which means including to the Gentiles. There was never a king in the Old Testament lineage who was some blessing to the entire earth. But that's the language that keeps coming up in Messianic prophecy. And verse 1, if you look back, says, he will bring justice to the nations. So the nations, the language for Gentile nations, gets repeatedly applied to the Messiah in these passages, because the Messiah is for all mankind. And in Isaiah, we're getting quite a bit of the language about how the Messiah reaches out to the blind, the prisoners, the lame, and so on, the meek. And there's no Davidic lineage king except Jesus who fit that description. Now, in chapter 49, there's a Messianic servant passage. And as with many passages about the Messiah, at a certain point as you're reading it, you think, well, this might be about Jesus, or it could be just about a good king, until you get to a certain point, where God says in verse 6, it is not enough for you, the servant, to be my servant, raising up the tribes of Jacob and restoring the protected ones, or remnant of Israel. I will also make you a light for the nations, to be my salvation to the ends of the earth. So we reach that verse, the salvation that reaches to the ends of the earth. And notice the word salvation used. Sometimes the word salvation appears in the Old Testament and it talks about being saved from the invading army. And we have to be careful not to say salvation in the Christian New Testament sense. It doesn't mean necessarily saving you in your relationship with God. Sometimes it's collectively the nation of Israel will get rescued. They'll get delivered from oppressors. They'll get delivered from being conquered. They'll get saved from exile. But if individual people scattered through all the nations of the earth are being saved, that's got to be something different. That's not, that every nation on the earth is being invaded and they're being saved in that sense by God. This truly is God's salvation as we think of it in the New Testament, reaching the ends of the earth. So, next week, we will take a look at the most famous servant song. The last three verses of Isaiah 52 and all of 53 are a song about the suffering servant who dies for our sins and who is rescued after death by God. It's the most pointed crucifixion, atonement, resurrection prophecy in all of the Old Testament, and that's why often we'll read it at the Lord's table and so on. So that'll be our topic for next week. And it's a beautiful passage that we'll look at. And then we'll also look at a passage that's really kind of best looked at in the New Testament when Jesus Christ applies it to himself, quoting word for word from Isaiah. So thank you very much for your attention.